Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to explore one of the most powerful, predictable, and frankly fundamentally misunderstood forces in global geopolitics. Today we're keeping our focus strictly on the undeniable causal link between surging food costs and the total collapse of governments. Because, when we think about regime change, it's so tempting to look at ideology or bitter political rivalries or sweeping democratic movements. But the data tells us a completely different, much more grounded story. The actual catalyst for state collapse is very often found right in the grocery aisle.
And there's a really profound truth about the regime collapses we saw back in 2010. The Arab Spring didn't start with a protest. It started with the price of bread. It's absolutely crucial that we shattered this misconception of spontaneous political awakenings. The massive wave of regime collapses from 2010 to 2011 is widely remembered as a political phenomenon, right? But before it was ever a political crisis, it was an acute crisis of human sustenance. People didn't just wake up one morning and decide to overthrow their governments in a vacuum. They were pushed to the absolute brink by the fundamental math of economic survival.
And this brilliantly illustrates that exact brink. Just look at the math here. In merely a 6-month window leading up to December 2010, the global price of wheat surged by 80%. 80%! Wheat was hitting record highs, and it wasn't just wheat either. This inflationary spike dragged up the costs of rice, corn, and cooking oil right alongside it. I mean, imagine your baseline costs for basic daily calories nearly doubling in half a year. For everyday people in vulnerable regions, this wasn't just some inconvenience or an annoying line item in a budget. It was a catastrophic shock that made basic survival mathematically impossible.
Which brings us to Tunisia and the really tragic reality of Mohamed Bouazizi. He was a fruit vendor who set himself on fire in late 2010, and he was pushed to the edge not by some sweeping political ideology, but by deep economic desperation and the sheer inability to afford to live. His tragic act was the spark, for sure, but the dry tinder, that was the surging cost of food we just looked at. That very real household-level desperation catalyzed a revolution that ended up toppling 4 different governments, destabilizing a dozen more, and completely reshaping the Middle East for a generation.
Let's move to the next piece of this and see how this actually builds, because this phenomenon isn't just about history, it's about mathematics. Researchers over at the IMF and the World Bank have studied this deeply, and they've identified what we can essentially call the tipping point. They found a crystal clear statistical correlation where economic strain effectively guarantees political instability. This is exactly what we mean when we talk about the anatomy of a catalyst. We're looking at a rigid, threshold-based mechanism that governs exactly how and when these states fracture.
Now, what's really interesting about this vulnerability metric is that it all comes down to a specific fraction of household income. The data shows us that the risk of instability spikes dramatically in countries where populations spend 40% or more of their total income just on food. Think about it. If you're in a wealthy nation where food is maybe 10 or 15% of your budget, a price spike hurts, sure, but you can cut back on entertainment or travel. But if 40% of your income is already dedicated just to basic calories, you have literally zero buffer. Any upward movement in global commodity prices hits bone immediately.
So the crucial point is the exact threshold the IMF identified, which is 10% food inflation. In this relationship, it isn't some slow, gradual, linear progression. It is a hard threshold. Below 10% food inflation, populations can generally absorb the cost. They adjust their household budgets, maybe they buy cheaper alternative grains. But the moment food inflation crosses above that 10% mark in those highly vulnerable nations, the math simply breaks. The system absolutely cannot hold the strain, and the probability of profound political instability just shoots upward dramatically.
Once that threshold gets breached, these vulnerable governments are backed into a corner with an impossible binary choice. On one hand, they can pass the cost on to the consumer, raise bread prices, and face immediate mass unrest out in the streets. Or, on the other hand, they can absorb the cost themselves to keep the peace by increasing state subsidies, which means they face the bond market and risk severe fiscal crisis or outright sovereign default. There is no winning move here when global food prices spike. It's a total catch-22.
To see exactly how this trap operates in the real world, we just have to look at Egypt. Egypt is actually the world's largest importer of wheat, bringing in over 60% of what it consumes. And the Egyptian government maintains the Baladi bread subsidy, providing artificially cheap bread to roughly 70 million people. In regions like North Africa and the Middle East, a bread subsidy isn't just a welfare program. It is the fundamental cornerstone of the social contract between the state and its citizens. So when global wheat prices explode, the cost to maintain that subsidy explodes right alongside it, putting immense pressure on a government that is often already managing a serious fiscal crisis. And this right here is exactly why this explainer matters so much today. If we take the conditions of 2010 and overlay them onto the 2026 Hormuz crisis, the exact same warning lights are flashing everywhere. Nations like Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and much of sub-Saharan Africa are currently being pushed right back toward and past that exact 10% mathematical tipping point we talked about. It is the exact same dynamic and the exact same vulnerability all over again. But it's actually even more complex this time around. Because of the direct effects of the Iran war, these nations aren't just dealing with a food price surge in a vacuum. They are simultaneously managing massive refugee flows, facing energy disruptions, battling broader economic slowdowns, and dealing with elevated military spending. And then, on top of all of that weakened infrastructure, comes the food inflation spike. The sheer weight of this compound stress replicates the 2010 and 2011 conditions with really alarming mathematical precision.
Which leads us to this core theme. Different trigger, same trajectory. Whether the initial catalyst is a poor harvest cycle, a global supply chain breakdown, or a regional conflict disrupting major shipping lanes, the underlying mechanism remains completely identical. Once the cost of basic food imports spikes in countries where the social contract relies heavily on cheap bread, the trajectory of government collapse follows a predictable, statistically verified path. The initial spark might be different this time, but the fuel on the ground is exactly the same. And the geopolitical consequences of this? They're permanent. Look, wars eventually end. Global markets inevitably stabilize, but when governments fall specifically during food crises, they tend to stay fallen. The historical record clearly demonstrates that the regimes that eventually replace them are very often less stable, less democratic, and way less cooperative with international institutions. The political instability triggered by something as simple as the price of wheat creates irreversible, long-term shifts in regional and global power dynamics.
So, what does this all mean for us going forward? I want to leave you with this final question to consider. Do you see the parallels between 2010-11 and the conditions we are tracking right now in 2026? Are we literally watching history repeat itself through the lens of commodity prices? I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this, so please drop them in the comments below. And hey, make sure you're subscribed because in our next explainer, we are going to dive into the phosphate rock question, which is another absolutely critical resource that is quietly shaping the entire future of global stability. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and I'll see you in the next one.